Hello everyone, I'm Jen and I make useful English Lit study videos on Shakespeare, poetry, fiction, literary ideas and more to help you become a literary expert. So if that sounds like what you need, make sure you hit the subscribe button below so you never miss out on my weekly videos. Now in today's video, we are looking at one of the most important literary essays of the 20th century, and that's the Modernist poet T.S. Eliot's Tradition and the Individual Talent, published in 1919, right after World War I. It's a document which may seem confusing at first read, partly because Eliot's prose can be a bit circumlocutory, but also because his message comes across a bit paradoxical, contradictory at times. Eliot seems to be saying that the poet, as the author of a poem, is in fact the least important thing in the construction of poetry. Then halfway through his essay, Eliot uses the curious and almost clinical term depersonalization, which reinforces the notion of a need to somehow sanitize or remove any trace of the poet in the poet's own work. Now, in order to unpack these observations, it's really key to set this essay in the broader context of literary history, and to remember that T.S. Eliot wrote this at the turn of the 20th century in the spirit of modernist experimentation and in reaction to the legacy of romantic individualism, which had loomed large over literary thinking throughout the 19th century. Now, one of the core tenets of Romanticism is the elevation of the individual genius as the supreme source of creative inspiration, with poets like William Wordsworth and Samuel Taylor Coleridge presenting the poet figure almost as a kind of pseudo-god possessed of deeper sensitivity, greater wisdom, and stronger insights than most common people. But T.S. Eliot attacks this haloizing impulse and asserts that the poet's personality should never be the point of their work. Through their writing, the poet should have already transformed whatever personal feelings and experiences into a more objective presentation of human experience, which the reader can appreciate not out of admiration or idolization of the poet, but of a sense of connectedness to the human universality and legacy embodied in the poem. So in a nutshell, according to T.S. Eliot, the poet's ego does not have a place in the work itself, or at least should not be prominently felt by the reader in any way. So another impression that I get from reading this essay is that Eliot almost seems to want to bring a degree of scientification to the poetic or the writing process, as if comparing verse writing to the chemical transformation of sulfurous acid would give the whole business of writing poetry a tad bit more intellectual rigor. Now, perhaps this was in part motivated by Eliot's clear disdain for the sort of vague, woolly, romantic ideas and writing about the soul and the sublime. And frankly, I'd argue that actually Eliot's own attempt at reframing the art of poetry as a kind of science through terms like depersonalization isn't really so convincing either. But anyway, it's important to know the intellectual context in which Eliot had written this essay, and in the spirit of Eliot's insistence on acknowledging literary tradition, to recognize how this essay is as much a conscious challenge to a past, refined romantic tradition as it is a loud cry for the birth of a new modernist poetics. With that, let's dive deeper into some of the key ideas in this seminal essay. Sit tight and let's dive straight into it. Now, the first point I want to make is that I really think Eliot has an axe to grind with his romantic predecessors, in that his own style, which is much more academic, elusive, and consciously intellectual, fundamentally contrasts with that of people like Wordsworth, Coleridge, and even John Keats, whose poetry is actually also quite heavily informed by classical allusions and influences. But the impassioned emotionality of Keats' register jars against Eliot's much calmer, introspective, and sometimes quite dry tone of voice. So while Eliot's main argument may be that the Romantics don't give enough credit to past literary influences in their poetry, his own issue is just as much a reflection of different personal preferences in style, taste, and tone. It's also a little bit ironic because the historical sense and tradition, keywords that Eliot uses in this essay, that he insists upon as part of every writer's inspiration is quite evident in the dynamics of this essay, in that without the Romantics' subjectivity-heavy philosophy to poetry, then Eliot himself wouldn't have had the material necessary to critique or challenge or to write this essay in the first place. So on a basic level, Eliot makes the reasonable claim that every poet must acknowledge themselves as being a product of past influences, i.e. of tradition, whether through their own absorption of knowledge from the works that they had themselves read, or through conscious mimicry of past authors' style. But Eliot then goes on to complicate this idea of tradition when he makes an interesting case for tradition as being a matter of much wider significance, as you'll see in this paragraph below. It cannot be inherited, and if you want it, you must obtain it by great labour. It involves, in the first place, the historical sense, which we may call nearly indispensable to anyone who would continue to be a poet beyond his 25th year. And the historical sense involves a perception, not only of the pastness of the past, but of its present. The historical sense compels a man to write not merely with his own generation in his bones, but with a feeling that the whole of the literature of Europe, from Homer, and within it the whole of the literature of his own country, has a simultaneous existence and composes a simultaneous order. Now, 2 points are worth noting here. First, there's a hint of Eliot's stuffy elitism in his claim that this sense of tradition can only be obtained by great labour, because what he is implying is that intellectual depth can only be acquired through an extensive period of study and time, which of course not everyone has the privilege to undertake, right? Unlike his own illustrious educational background of having studied at an independent prep school and then at Harvard through undergrad to postgrad. There's a subtle arrogance then in the veiled suggestion that anyone who has not invested significant effort into reading, studying, and labouring over past writing, such as the Greek and Latin classics and Shakespeare, which are of course sources that Eliot himself often alludes to and include in his poems, won't really ever qualify as a real excellent poet, at least not to Eliot's standards. For him, it's not enough to just tap into one's own repository of emotions and memories as inspiration for poetry, however rich and intense they may be. One must situate such subjective elements within the broader socio-cultural and intellectual landscape of the times, and to consider the significance of the self in relation to the zeitgeist of their era. Now, this leads us to the second point, which is the rather paradoxical idea of a historical sense which perceives not only of the pastness of the past, but also of its present. Now, to understand the statement, perhaps it's worth remembering that this essay was published right after World War I, a time when the world order was pretty much flipped on its head, with the levers of power gradually shifting from a war-battered Europe to the relatively isolated and increasingly prosperous United States. Now, Eliot himself, as a transatlantic scholar who had spent most of his World War I years cooped up at Harvard in Boston, and then the tail end of his academic career at Oxford in England, would have likely felt more strongly than most people this remarkable tectonic change in the global energy, not just in the geographical shift of power, but in the reorientation of focus from the individual self to the relationship of the self with a bigger, volatile, and much more uncontrollable and unpredictable world. Despite Eliot's relative shelteredness as an ivory tower academic, he wasn't exactly living in a time where contemplative afternoon strolls in the garden was encouraged or even possible, unlike, say, Wordsworth at Grasmere. And as someone immersed in the chaotic, violent backdrop of a large-scale war, it's really unsurprising then that Eliot's purview as a poet would have been of a much wider, more historically informed scope, one which compels a man to write not merely with his own generation in his bones, but with a feeling that the whole of the literature of his own country has a simultaneous existence and composes a simultaneous order. So note the grandiose diction that Eliot uses here, with words like country, existence, order, all conveying a sense of vastness which no longer allows for thinking about poetry in a localized, individual, and solipsistic frame of mind. So what this observation shows us then is that Eliot himself was probably deeply affected by this historical sense, in part also because he was living in a particular historical period when it was almost impossible, unless one were a troglodyte, to not recognize the comparative smallness and powerlessness of a single individual. However ingenious or brilliant someone is, they will always be subject to the sweeping, grand forces of social and global change. By the way, guys, if you find this video helpful so far, I'd massively appreciate it if you could hit the thumbs up button below and subscribe to my channel so that you don't miss out on any of my top grade lit study content going forward. I'd also encourage you to check out my membership program by clicking the join button below if you want exclusive access to members only study content and make special video requests. I'll see you there. Let's consider, however, that people like Wordsworth had actually also lived through some pretty turbulent times, not least the 1789 French Revolution, but instead of inspiring Wordsworth to incorporate more of the external world or historical sense in his verse, the revolution actually had somewhat of an opposite effect on the Romantic poet, who had instead chosen to turn inward and to shift from registering the concrete materiality of this messy world he was living in to delving more deeply into the more insular, but perhaps more reassuring state of his inner mind and soul. So anyway, my point is that perhaps it's a bit unfair to say that the Romantics had not also recognized a historical sense in their own writing. More likely, they did very much register it, but unlike Eliot, they had opted to escape from it by fencing some of it off, by fencing off one of the very few sanctuaries that they could find, which was poetry and the writing process, from all of the disorder and noise of an ever fragmented world. Now, here's a question for you. Imagine if you had written a poem and you're incredibly proud of it, right? And you show it to your friends and family. How would you want them to praise it, assuming, well, that they do in the first place? Would you want them to say, wow, there's so much feeling in your writing, it really moves me? Or would you be more flattered if they had said, geez, your writing is so smart and knowledgeable, I can tell you put a lot of hard work into it? So in a nutshell, the former compliment, poetry that prides itself on the force of feeling, is very much the hallmark of Romantic poetry, whereas the latter, poetry characterized by being difficult, to use Eliot's own word, meaning intellectually rigorous in this context, is the aspiration of Modernist verse. Now, this relates to a somewhat confusing distinction that Eliot tries to make in this essay, which is that between emotion and feeling, as he asserts that great poetry may be made without the direct use of any emotion whatever, but it's composed out of feelings solely. Now, this supposed distinction between emotion and feeling may seem a bit odd to the general reader, right, who probably understand these words to be pretty synonymous. But perhaps what Eliot is saying here is that the excellence of poetry doesn't lie in its ability to convey clean, identifiable emotions like happiness, sadness, anger, or whatever you have it, but in the very process of the poet of having first felt a medley of emotions on their own, and then channeling and transmuting the force of these emotions into their verbal craft. And in their poetry, they don't actually portray these same emotions that they had experienced, even if these emotions had motivated or inspired them to write poetry in the first place. So for example, Eliot could have felt depressed by, say, the passing of his dog one morning, but instead of writing a poem about the deep sadness he feels over the passing of his dog, he would perhaps write a poem about a box of sweets that had gone missing from the cabinet, and the breeze of a random spring draft reminding him of a childhood experience. I.e., he's probably going to write about something that's totally unrelated on the surface, but the process of the poet's writing about these seemingly unrelated topics will inevitably be informed by and infused with those very same emotions of sadness that he had felt over, say, the death of his pet dog. So perhaps Eliot's point then is that instead of focusing on describing one's emotions in their work, it's more impactful to focus on really feeling those emotions prior to writing anything. Because in the act of letting one feel those emotions truly, one is able to unite these particles to create new poetic compounds, as he states that it is not the greatness, the intensity of the emotions, the components, but the intensity of the artistic process, the pressure, so to speak, under which the fusion takes place, that counts. So Eliot calls all of this depersonalization, which is just his pseudoscientific term for saying that poets shouldn't talk about themselves so much in the stuff that they write. Well, open shade alert, lyric poetry, hello. But basically, if we strip down all of his befuddling, ping-ponging semantics between emotion and feeling, Eliot is really just expressing his exasperation of what he sees to be a rather narcissistic, solipsistic mode of writing that characterizes a lot of Romantic poetry from his point of view. One in which the singular I and the self, with this capitalized S, looms way too large, which perhaps seems all the more frivolous and unjustifiable at a time when masses upon masses of people are dying on the battlefield in the Great War, a context in which the individual has become so insignificant and devalued. And after all, when most people who die don't even have their names remembered or recorded, what point is there even to consider the state of the individual soul? So while I appreciate the logic behind Eliot's argument, I think the way he illustrates this somewhat nuanced distinction between the so-called inferiority of poetry of emotion versus the preferred poetry by feeling is a bit contrived, if not altogether a bit unconvincing. Specifically, he cites a passage from the Renaissance dramatist Thomas Middleton's play The Revenger's Tragedy, in which the speaker, Vindici, expresses his emotional contradiction of on the one hand feeling a strong attraction towards a woman's beauty, and yet recognizing the destructiveness that comes with giving into illicit sexual desires. But what's odd is that Eliot reduces the psychological complexity of this moment to a blunt dichotomy of there's a combination of positive and negative emotions, which is somehow separate from what he ambiguously terms the whole effect, the dominant tone, which is a product of, he calls, a number of floating feelings by no means superficially evident, combined with it to give us a new art emotion. So based on this description, which frankly is a bit confusing, if Eliot's intention was to persuade us of his ability to justify poetry and art through more scientific rigor, then my view is that he didn't really quite succeed here, if he can even do this at all. Because the wooliness in his own prose, ironically, tells me that, like his romantic forebears, not least Wordsworth in his preface to the lyrical ballads, Eliot himself also struggles to find the right words required for him to communicate the kind of conscious and deliberate clarity that he claims is going to be the hallmark of great 20th century poetic language. So anyway, the key takeaway from all of this attempt at delineating categories like emotion versus feeling, tradition versus personality, etc., is that perhaps there is a central irony which Eliot demonstrates here through his own failure to kind of scientificize poetry. Writing is an ongoing struggle, and that it is largely meaningless to try to set apart one aspect of the poet from another, or else activating one impulse while suppressing another. Not only because it's futile and impossible, because every poet is at once a product of their past and present, and every poem embodies the poet's emotions while conveying ideas other than their set emotions. But more importantly, the continual struggle in balancing the ever-looming influence of literary legacy with the ever-present awareness of one's unique self and its subjectivity is about finding the generative synergy between tradition and personality that is arguably the greatest source of poetic inspiration. So it's neither one or the other, but the dialectic, the interplay of tradition and personality, which is ultimately what yields the spirit of a new modernist kind of poetics. And there you have it, everyone. That's my analysis of T.S. Eliot's Tradition and the Individual Talent essay, which is probably one of the most important essays for any higher level literature student. I hope you found my insights illuminating and useful, especially as a kind of contextual framework for your understanding of modernist literature as a whole, not least as a framework to understand Eliot's own writing. So for your next video, I recommend that you watch my analysis of Eliot's poem, The Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock, which is a great text to read in light of the key ideas covered in this tradition essay. And you can check that out right here. Hit that thumbs up button below if you found this video helpful so that you too will spread it to more passionate lit learners all around the world like yourself, and that you can encourage me to keep making these useful study videos for you. Please subscribe if you haven't already and switch on that bell notification below so you don't miss out on any of my future weekly videos. You can also consider joining my membership program if you want to make exclusive video requests and enjoy essay review perks. You can check that out by clicking the join button below. And as always, I will see you in the next one.